Tzarayim Tovim. For those of you that are fasting, Tzom Kal, I will stay hydrated as I must. This week we are discussing Parshat Pinchas and lessons on leadership, what men can learn from women. Our Parsha begins with a scenario involving the one by whom this Parsha is known, Pinchas. In chapter 25, verses 10 through 12, we read, "And God spoke to Moshe, saying, Pinchas ben Eliezer ben Aaron HaKohen, Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aharon, the priest, has turned my wrath, Eshiv et Chamoti, away from the children of Israel, and that he was very jealous for my sake among them, and I consumed not the children of Israel my jealousy. Wherefore say, Hineni noten lo et briti shalom, I give him the covenant of my peace, and it shall be unto him and to his seed after him the covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because asher kina lelokav, because he was jealous for his God, v'yechaper al b'nei Yisrael, made atonement for the children of Israel." Now, Rashi suggests that even though God does indeed seem pleased with the results of Pinchas' initiative to uphold the standards of God that God wished to have the B'nai Yisrael live by, there may have been other reasons for Pinchas' reaction. His motivations might not have been as pure as we would like to think, as he exacts retribution from the Israelite man who has been intimate with the Midianite woman. A definite no-no, potentially breaking the norms and compromising the very fabric of this society. Here we have an action that is very male, if you will, and we are just not sure about the thought process behind it. On the other side of the coin, there are those who would be glad to find fault with Pinchas, and many others who would act in such an aggressive manner for all kinds of reasons. Chazal teach that there are leaders at that time who thought that Pinchas should have been excommunicated for such an initiative in which he kills a man on the spur of the moment, so to speak, as it is somewhat in line with other examples of male aggression we have noted earlier and will continue to see. And that only the voice and declaration of God here saves him from that fate of destruction. Nechama Leibowitz teaches that in considering Pinchas, this deed of summary justice, taking the law into his own hands, constituted a dangerous precedent from the social, moral, and educational angle, even suggesting our questioning God's reaction or reward for such passionate zeal and its immediate results. In the Torah Tamima, Rabbi Baruch Epstein teaches, such a deed must be animated by a genuine, unadulterated spirit of zeal to advance the glory of God. In such a case, who can tell whether the perpetrator is not really prompted by some selfish motive, maintaining that he is doing it for the sake of God when he has actually committed murder? That is why Chazal wished to excommunicate Pinchas, had not the Ruach HaKodesh testified that his zeal for God was real. Perhaps we should still not be completely satisfied, for was this really God's will initially, or rather God's acceptance of the imperfect thinking process of Pinchas? Motivation was perhaps okay, but action and reaction not so much. This discussion of action and reaction and perspective is continually widened today in our own social, cultural, national, and human context, and by unavoidable association when we think of ourselves as religious beings as well. A most interesting anthropological perspective regarding this discourse is presented by Yuval Noah Harari in his acclaimed book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. In his scholarly and well-researched work, Harari posits that for many ages before our own, everyone dealt only with real goods, such as property, human beings, land, trees, and so forth. As society grew from smaller units we may think of as tribal to larger interactive and interdependent social entities, there had to be a shared belief in myths. Now, for Hariri, in terms of full disclosure, belief in God is just a myth, as he is a Chiluni, a secular Israeli who claims national affinity but does not accept the religious nomenclature as a Jew per se. That being acknowledged, for those of us for whom God and God's domain is quite real, for example, I, for one, see the reality of God in all human beings created, in all of nature, and in the deeds of good done by individuals and groups. His notion of social constructs as myths that are shared is quite valuable for us, nonetheless, when we consider inequality and lack of equal accessibility in our own lives. Whether we are, as he, talking about racial differences, socioeconomical differences, those between castes in other societies, and those between men and women for all time in all places, the power of shared myths in our lives is a valuable one to consider when we think about the practicality of our own experience. Why are there such separate narratives for males and females? Is this biological or sociologically and culturally maintained and acquired? As we are considering the differences between a male show of influence and that of women later in our Parsha, let us learn a bit from Hariri. He teaches as follows in his book. This part is called patriarchal genes. A third type of biological explanation gives less importance to brute force and violence and suggests that through millions of years of evolution, men and women evolved different survival and reproductive strategies. As men competed against each other for the opportunity to impregnate fertile women, an individual's chances of reproduction depended above all on his ability to outperform and defeat other men. As time went on, the masculine genes that made it to the next generation were those belonging to the most ambitious, aggressive, and competitive men. A woman, on the other hand, had no problem finding a man willing to impregnate her. However, if she wanted her children to provide her with grandchildren, she needed to carry them in her womb for 9 arduous months and then nurture them for many years. During that time, she had fewer opportunities to obtain food and required a lot of help. In other words, she needed a man. In order to ensure her own survival and the survival of her children, the woman had little choice but to agree to whatever conditions the man stipulated so that he would stick around and share some of the burden. As time went by, the feminine genes that made it to the next generation belonged to women who were the submissive caretakers. Women who spent too much time fighting for power did not leave any of those powerful genes for future generations. The result of these different survival strategies, so the theory goes, is that men have been programmed to be ambitious and competitive and to excel in politics and business, to win, whereas women have tended to move out of the way and dedicate their lives to raising their children. Hariri continues a bit later. After the agricultural revolution, human societies grew even larger and more complex, while the imagined constructs sustaining the social order also became more elaborate. Myths and fictions accustomed people nearly from the moment of birth to think of certain ways, to behave in accordance with certain standards, to want certain things, and to observe certain rules. They thereby created artificial instincts that enabled millions of strangers to agree to cooperate effectively. This network of artificial instincts we call culture. Hariri holds that we are hardwired and that each gender has preferred strategies to address problems and challenges. If someone in their respective gender grouping goes against type, we may have what to say. And again, remember, I'm the one who teaches about the continuum of gender diversity, sexuality diversity, the 12 terms found in Torah and in rabbinics. But this ethnographer, cultural anthropologist, this Chiloni Jew, Yuval Noah Hariri, is looking at the dichotomous reality or construct of male and female. He wants us to ask, is Moshe too meek? Is Yael later in our narrative too aggressive? Do Chava and Rivka and Tamar help to further the notion of women as conniving or tricky? Should Aharon have been more assertive and stopped, not facilitated, the building of the Egel Masecha? As we learn in our contemporary study of gender types and makeup, it is not an either-or matter, but rather one of degree, and that we all share so much, while there are things that divide us. That being said, in the narrative of Bamidbar and of this period of history, it would seem that there are expectations of male actions zealously defending God by reacting against someone who has done something considered to be against the social norms, if you will. There are expectations of male actions and initiatives. There are expectations of a more passive female position in society. Part of that differentiation is that land was always inherited through the male lineage of a given family or tribe. We read all of the names of the tribes who will be granted their portion of land. In Parak 26, verses 52 through 54, we learn, and God spoke to Moshe, saying, Le'ele techalek ha'aretz b'nachala b'mispar shamot. Unto the males, the land will be divided as an inheritance according to the number of folks in each of the clans. To the more, you should give more inheritance. To the less, you should give less. But to each one, ish lefi pikudav, to each one according to those that were numbered as part of his tribe. This follows the notion that we're talking about a culture of real acquisitions, land, farm, things, how one determines one's value. One could suggest that this was a reasonable means of assessment of land to ensure the continuation of various tribes and individuals, as land was definitely the most valuable real commodity. It's clearly not a myth of any type. It was real in every way. It was touchable. It was workable. It was tangible. From an organizational point of view, all would have status as members of community by virtue of the land bequeathed unto the male line of relations, and women would marry into those familial units. But then we have this family, the B'not Zelophachad, the daughters of Zelophachad. In this family, there are only daughters. This goes against type. These daughters perceived a pending injustice as there were no sons to continue the land legacy so central to their lives individually as families, inherited generations, and so on. In chapter 27, verses 1 through 11, we learn about their significance. The daughters of Zelophachad, Vatikravna, come close. Zelophachad, the son of Hefer, the son of Gilad, the son of Machir, the son of Menashe, of the families of Menashe, the son of Yosef. And these are the names of the daughters, Machlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. We're given the names indicating that they are significant. We begin this Parsha with names, Pinchas, and we're going to end with B'not Zelophachad by name. B'lifnei Moshe ta'amodna. They stand before Moshe and Elazar the priest and before the princes of the congregation at the door of the tent of meeting, and they say, Avinu bet bamidbar v'lo haya betoch ha'edah anoadim al Hashem. Our father died in the wilderness, and he was not amongst those who rebelled in any of the rebellions, not with Korach, not with any of the others that were mentioned. He was not one of those that rebelled against God. He died in his own sin, and there are commentaries about why he died. But uvanim lo hayula. Lo, there were no sons to him. Why should the name of our father, Lama Yigarash Shem Avinu Mitoch Mishpachato, be taken away from his family? Notice what the question is. Why should the name of our father, so they're doing it lichlodo, in honor of the father. They come, they approach, they ask, they appeal to reason. They work within the cultural context of the community, unlike Pinchas. Why should the name of our father be done away with among his family? Because he had no son. Tana lanu achuzah. Give us the inheritance. Like Rab Moshe, Lifnei Hashem, Moshe brings their case before God, and God speaks to Moshe saying, Ken, B'not Zelophachad divarot. They spoke correctly. You will give them a possession of inheritance amongst their father's brethren, and you will cause the inheritance of their father to pass to them. And you will speak to the children of Israel, saying, and here we have a modification of the original law. Remember that, because several weeks later, at Hanan, we're going to speak about how many different situations can we imagine and how many changes can we make, and there are infinite possibilities, and how do we do that in terms of ensuring that the law will work. The daughters of Zelophachad speak correctly. Give them a possession of the inheritance amongst their father's brethren, and they will have an inheritance. They will be able to pass on the inheritance of their father. And you now make the law saying, Ish kiyumutu ben ein lo, vavartam en echalato lebito. If a man dies, if a human being dies, if a landowner who has standing in the community dies and has no son, you give his property to his daughter. And if he has no daughter, you give it to his brethren. And if his father has no brethren, then you give the inheritance to his kinsmen that are next to him in the family, and he shall possess it. This will be the judgment as God has commanded Moshe. As we've said, note that the names of Zelophachad's daughters are given, indicating that each one is noteworthy individually as well as being part of the collective family unit. Rashi asks the question as to why women are not generally included initially in the land distribution process, given that in moments of extreme angst and rebellion, for example, the Egel HaZahav, Korach, we're taught that women did not participate, as did not the patriarch in this instance of this particular family. Is this because, as Hariri would have it, that they were passive and accepted their inferior position in society, or is there something else that might be going on here? Let us think about this. This is not the first time that women act upon our narrative in ways that are significant and bring about notable changes. Chava, Sarah, Tamar, later Ruth, Hannah, and others definitely do not act by wielding a sword. All right, notwithstanding Yael and the milk thing with the soldier, we'll put that aside. They're not physically active or aggressive, but their influence is inescapable. Note how the perceived wrong is presented, with reason and justification, not taking things into their own hands, but coming to God, coming to the priest, coming to Moshe. The daughters claim that their father died as a result of his own misdeed. He did not cause others to sin, as indicated in the instances above. What would that misdeed have been? Some, though not all agree, suggest that here is the one who may have been carrying wood on Shabbat, according to Rabbi Akiva. Nonetheless, whatever he did that was wrong. There are no sons. There's no way to ensure the continuation of this line. So this is the approach that the daughters take. Just as a side note, as someone who both goes by my husband's name and also uses my name before I married Ken professionally, and it's a source of humorous debate in my household. Think about this. This is, there's no Shmot HaMishpacha, there's tribal belonging, that's all. Land, it's land, it's land, it's land. And by the way, the B'not Zelophachad are told that they will marry into their own tribe, which some people say, oh, but you're limiting who they marry. Well, everybody was limited in who they married. It's taking how we look at marriage today out of context and applying it to another social situation. But the fact of the matter is they will be the vehicle through which land will pass from the previous generation to the next generation, and this will ensure the continuation of the line. This is the approach that the daughters take, knowing that they will have to marry within their own tribe, accepting both the responsibility and the privilege of the land and passing it on, so that they ensure that all land remains within the respective family lines. Rashi teaches that the daughters state that they are willing to stand bimkom ben, in place of the male inheritors in their absence. He suggests that in agreeing to do so, they are showing true understanding of what it means to be part of the B'nai Yisrael and are acting in a way actually superior to many men. Here, this action is not precipitous or without thought, quite the opposite. In the Likutei Sichot from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, we learn that women are endowed with a thoughtfulness and intentionality that is to be honored and cited as superior qualities that we all need to follow. I know that there are those who would choose to reduce that to rabbinic apologetics, but it really isn't. And if you ever studied Kabbalah, and if you've ever studied Jewish mysticism, you see that there's this balance of Zachar and Nekeva, male and female. Others suggest that by stating that Zelophachad was not part of Korach's rebellion, the daughters are protesting indirectly, but with a clear message, namely, what exactly is the reason our family will not be given land when they did not participate in these actions? The Zohar suggests that Zelophachad's daughters drew near to Moshe in the presence of Eliezer and all the chieftains because they were afraid of Moshe's anger at Zelophachad or at being challenged, and thought by doing so publicly, Moshe would have to contain himself and his reaction, not the meek Moshe that we would ask about. Clearly not. Some suggest that Moshe presented the case to God instead of deciding it himself out of modesty, while others indicate that this is a really wonderful teachable moment showing, one, God might have thought of everything, but we cannot realistically have every possibility laid out for us in law, and this lesson will be repeated. Think of any government or entity that drafts an initial constitution that will have to be amended. Here we see how the law can be expanded in terms of its initial intention without being changed. We have to be very careful about that, because when we say lo tasif v'lo tigra, don't add, don't subtract, there are those that do expand the law beyond the intent of the original word. And that's where we get into a lot of problems in terms of halacha. 2, in the merit of Zelophachad's daughters, we now not only adjust this practice of inherited lands, but we also show the expansion of the original intention of this law to accommodate when there are no sons, no daughters, and so on. In other words, it didn't just make the corrective for the daughters, but it says, if not here, then we go to this relative, we go to this relative, we go to this relative. There's a line of inheritance that now goes further. There will be instances of such laws and dictates throughout our legal texts that will need such attention and processing, reflecting the thoughtfulness with which the argument was originally presented, quite unlike the way Pinchas chose to resolve the issue that confronted him. In the Gemara, we are taught that Zelophachad's daughters were wise and righteous women, and that they demonstrated their wisdom by raising the case in a timely fashion, just as Moshe was to begin expounding the laws that were relevant, so that the expansion, as we read, and Zelophachad's daughters, that timing was, if you will, coordinated. The daughters also demonstrated their righteousness by marrying men who were fitting for them within their tribes, maintaining both their father's legacy, the legacy of their husbands, and ensuring the continuation of all within the tribal unit. Women will become property owners in their own right as time does move on, as evidenced in the text of Eov, where his daughters will inherit equally amongst their brothers without any qualifications. Here we have a most interesting approach to change. When we ask why the law is what it is and how we can be accommodated, that approach engenders a response that is equally reasonable. Ellie will learn the same from Hannah when he accuses her of being drunk as she quietly mouths her prayers to God. And as in our case here in our Parsha, the Gemara in Masechet Brachot teaches at length how so many of our practices in prayer are developed through the example of Hannah, acting reasonably even in the midst of her pain. As many listening to this shiur are well know, and I mentioned earlier, I teach about gender in our foundational texts. And I am the first one to state that depending on how one counts, there are up to 12 different gendered terms in our Jewish sources. Gender is not dichotomous. Having stated that, we all have components in our beings, reactions to situations in our lives, and areas of expertise that may be considered male or female, regardless of our actual identified gender. As Rashi and Chassidut suggest, amongst others, here we see two examples of how we address our problems. Do we do so immediately, zealously, passionately, with a quick reaction? Or do we do so with reason and processing, showing patience and engaging all in trying to look at a challenge from all sides? In thinking about our lives today as we consider these options, I feel that it goes without saying that we need much more of the latter and quite less of the former. Shabbat shalom l'kulam. Lehitraat.